There are moments when you realize that the person you love most in the world sees you as nothing more than an obstacle. For me, that moment came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, when my own son stood in my bedroom doorway and smiled while I gasped for air. My name is Irene, and I'm 55 years old. 25 years ago, I became a widow with a 10-year-old boy to raise. 25 years of double shifts at the hospital, of choosing between buying myself new shoes or getting Marcus the latest video game he wanted. 25 years of telling myself that sacrifice was love, that giving everything meant I was a good mother. I never remarried. How could I? Every man who showed interest faded away when they realized I came as a package deal. Me and a boy who demanded all my attention, all my energy, all my resources. Marcus needs stability, I would tell them, and myself. Marcus needs his mother. So I stayed alone, pouring every ounce of myself into raising the child who had become my entire world. The irony is devastating now. All those years I spent in hospital corridors, breathing in disinfectant and industrial cleaning chemicals, working 16-hour shifts to pay for his college, his car, his dreams. Those same years slowly destroyed my lungs. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, the doctor said with the clinical detachment that medical professionals use when delivering life sentences. COPD, a death sentence delivered in acronyms. You'll need oxygen therapy, Dr. Patterson explained, his voice gentle but firm. 24 hours a day. This isn't temporary, Irene. This is your new reality. The machine arrived the next week, a constant companion that hissed and hummed, reminding me with every breath that my body was failing, that the years of sacrifice had extracted a price I couldn't afford but had already paid. Marcus was 35 then, recently divorced, claiming he needed time to figure things out. When he asked to move back home temporarily, I said yes without hesitation. What mother wouldn't? He was my son, my only child, the person I'd built my entire adult life around. I told myself this was temporary, that he needed support during a difficult transition, that having him close would actually be a blessing now that I was dealing with my own health struggles. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers and it really helps our work. And let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. I should have recognized the signs earlier. The way he looked at the oxygen tank like it was an invader in his childhood home. The heavy sighs when the concentrator's gentle hum interrupted his phone calls. The barely contained irritation when I needed help carrying the portable tank upstairs. My breath coming in short, desperate gasps that embarrassed him in ways he didn't bother to hide. Do you have to use that thing all the time? He asked one evening, gesturing dismissively at the nasal cannula that kept me alive. We were watching television, or rather, I was watching while he scrolled through his phone, the blue light illuminating a face that looked more like his father every day, but without any of the kindness that had made me fall in love 28 years ago. Marcus, you know I need oxygen constantly, I replied, my voice already breathless from the simple act of speaking. The doctor explained a lot of things, he interrupted, not looking up from his screen. Doesn't mean they're all necessary. You managed fine for 53 years without that machine attached to your face. The casual cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. This was my son, the child I'd rocked to sleep through countless fevered nights, the boy I'd cheered for at every school play and baseball game, the young man whose graduation had filled me with pride so fierce it felt like my heart might burst. And he spoke about my medical equipment, the difference between life and death, as if it were a personal inconvenience he was being forced to tolerate. That conversation was 3 months ago. Since then, things have gotten progressively worse. Marcus treats my illness like a character flaw, something I've chosen to inflict upon him rather than a consequence of decades spent caring for other people's loved ones in hospital halls that never had adequate ventilation. He started bringing friends over without warning, men his age who look at me with the particular mixture of pity and disgust reserved for people whose bodies have betrayed them in visible ways. "This is my mom," he'll say, his tone carrying undertones of apology that make my chest tighten in ways that have nothing to do with lung capacity. "She's got some health issues." As if I'm a problem to be managed rather than the woman who sacrificed everything to give him the life he wanted, the opportunities he took for granted, the unconditional love that apparently had conditions after all. The portable oxygen tank has become a source of particular annoyance for him. When I need to move around the house, the small wheeled concentrator follows me like a faithful pet, its quiet whoosh-click rhythm marking each breath that keeps me conscious, keeps me present, keeps me alive. Marcus has started making comments about the sound, calling it distracting and constant, as if my need to breathe is somehow inconsiderate of his comfort. Last week, he moved my bedroom setup without asking, relocating the main concentrator to a corner where the tubing barely reached my bed. When I asked him to move it back, explaining that I needed the machine close enough to reach the controls during the night, he rolled his eyes with the exaggerated patience of someone dealing with an unreasonable child. "Mom, you don't need to touch anything on that machine. It runs automatically. Stop being so paranoid about every little thing." But paranoid wasn't the right word for what I felt. Fear was more accurate. The deep, primal terror that comes with depending on technology for survival while living with someone who views that dependency as weakness rather than medical necessity. The nights are the hardest. During the day, I can distract myself with television or books, can focus on small tasks that make me feel useful despite my limitations. But at night, lying in the darkness with only the oxygen concentrator's gentle rhythm for company, I'm forced to confront the reality of my situation. I'm completely dependent on a machine that could malfunction, on electricity that could fail, on a son who increasingly sees me as a burden rather than the mother who gave him everything. Sometimes I lie awake listening to Marcus moving around the house, hearing him laugh during phone conversations with friends, catching fragments of complaints about his situation at home. I've become his situation, not his mother, not the woman who worked herself into lung disease to provide for him, but a situation that needs to be managed, endured, eventually resolved. The oxygen flows through clear plastic tubing at 2 liters per minute, a rate calculated to keep my blood saturated enough to prevent organ damage while conserving the machine's capacity for continuous operation. 2 liters per minute of the difference between consciousness and collapse, between coherent thought and the gray fog that descends when my brain doesn't receive adequate oxygen. I know these technical details because I've had to learn them, had to become an expert in my own survival in ways that healthy people never have to consider. I know that my oxygen saturation should stay above 90%, know that the pulse oximeter clipped to my finger will alarm if my levels drop too low, know that without supplemental oxygen, I would lose consciousness within minutes and die within hours. Marcus doesn't know these details, and he's made it clear he doesn't want to learn them. "That's what doctors are for," he says when I try to explain the importance of backup power sources or proper tubing maintenance. I'm not a nurse. The irony cuts deep. I was a nurse, spent decades caring for patients whose families hung on every word about treatment plans and medication schedules, and now my own son can't be bothered to understand the basic requirements for keeping me alive. Tomorrow marks exactly 6 months since my diagnosis. 6 months since the machine arrived and changed everything about how I exist in the world. 6 months of watching my son's patience erode, his resentment grow, his presence in my home transform from comfort to constant tension. But tonight, as I prepare for sleep with the cannula positioned carefully in my nostrils and the concentrator humming its reliable song beside my bed, I still tell myself that this is temporary, that Marcus is adjusting to his own life changes and will eventually remember that I'm his mother, not his enemy, that love will triumph over inconvenience, that family bonds will prove stronger than his obvious discomfort with my medical needs. I still believe, despite everything, that my son loves me, that the boy I raised with such devotion is still somewhere inside the man who treats my oxygen tank like a personal affront to his comfort. I have to believe this because the alternative is too devastating to contemplate. The alternative is that I spent 25 years sacrificing everything for someone who sees my continued existence as an imposition rather than a gift. Tonight, I'll sleep with that hope. Tomorrow, perhaps, will bring the understanding and compassion I've been waiting for. I have no idea how wrong I am. The first time Marcus called me dead weight was during a phone conversation he thought I couldn't hear. I was in my bedroom, supposedly napping, but sleep had become elusive since the oxygen therapy began. The machine's constant hum, while necessary, had disrupted the natural rhythms I'd relied on for 55 years. I can't do anything with her attached to that machine. His voice carried through the thin walls of our modest home. He was talking to someone, probably his ex-wife Sarah, or maybe his friend Jake from work. She can't go anywhere without dragging that tank behind her. It's like living with dead weight that needs constant attention. Dead weight. The phrase hit me with such force that I actually gasped, triggering the pulse oximeter's gentle beep as my heart rate spiked. Dead weight. Not his mother, not the woman who had worked double shifts for 25 years to ensure he never felt the sting of poverty that had marked my own childhood. Dead weight. Something to be discarded, disposed of, eliminated. I lay there listening to him continue his conversation, each word driving deeper into wounds I hadn't realized existed. "The worst part is the guilt trip," he said, his voice taking on the particular tone of someone who believes they're the victim in a situation where they hold all the power. "She acts like I should be grateful she's still alive, like I owe her something because she worked herself sick. Worked myself sick." Even that he twisted into something selfish, something I had done to burden him rather than something that happened because I loved him more than my own health, more than my own future, more than my own life. The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, during which I learned things about my son that shattered whatever illusions I'd maintained about his character. He complained about the cost of my medications, though I paid for them with my disability benefits. He mocked my need for assistance with tasks that had become difficult since my breathing capacity diminished. He even laughed, actually laughed, when describing how I sometimes fell asleep in my chair during the day, exhausted by the simple effort of existing with compromised lungs. When he finally ended the call, I heard his footsteps approaching my bedroom. I quickly closed my eyes and regulated my breathing, or as much as someone with COPD can regulate anything about their respiratory function. He knocked softly, the kind of gentle tap that might have seemed caring to an outside observer. "Mom, you okay in there?" His voice carried just the right note of concern, the perfect pitch of a dutiful son checking on his ailing mother. If I hadn't heard his true feelings minutes earlier, I might have been touched by his apparent solicitude. "I'm fine, Marcus," I called back, proud that my voice remained steady despite the emotional earthquake that had just rearranged my internal landscape. "Just resting." "Okay, let me know if you need anything." The footsteps retreated, and I was left alone with the new knowledge that everything I'd believed about our relationship had been built on foundations of sand. That night marked a turning point. Not immediately, not dramatically, but with the slow, inexorable shift of someone realizing that the ground beneath their feet has been eroding for longer than they understood. The son I thought I knew, the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and declare them the most beautiful flowers in the world. The teenager who had hugged me fiercely after his high school graduation and whispered, "Thank you for everything, Mom." That person either no longer existed or had never existed at all. Over the following weeks, Marcus's behavior became increasingly careless, as if he'd given up pretending to care about my feelings or well-being. He started inviting people over without warning me. Sometimes friends from work who would stare at my oxygen equipment with undisguised curiosity, other times women he was dating who looked at me like I was an embarrassing family secret he couldn't quite figure out how to hide. "This is Mom," he would say, his introduction carrying an undertone of apology that made each meeting excruciating. "She's got some breathing problems." Breathing problems. As if 25 years of hospital chemicals and secondhand stress from caring for dying patients was equivalent to a mild seasonal allergy. The women were particularly difficult to endure. They were younger, healthier, vibrant in ways I remembered being before my body began its systematic betrayal. They would smile politely and make small talk, but I could see the calculations behind their eyes, assessing how long I might live, how much care I would require, what kind of burden I would represent in any future they might build with my son. One evening, a woman named Tiffany joined us for dinner. She was probably 35, blonde, with the kind of effortless beauty that comes from good genetics and adequate sleep. She worked in marketing, she told me, her voice bright with the confidence of someone whose biggest daily challenge involved choosing between latte flavors, rather than struggling to draw sufficient breath for basic conversation. "Marcus tells me you used to be a nurse," she said, cutting her chicken with precise movements that suggested she'd never had to pause mid-meal to catch her breath. That must have been rewarding work. Used to be, past tense, as if my decades of experience, my accumulated knowledge, my ability to comfort frightened families and advocate for vulnerable patients had all been erased by my need for supplemental oxygen. It was, I replied, carefully measuring my words to avoid triggering the breathlessness that often accompanied longer conversations. I specialized in cardiac care, spent a lot of time with families going through difficult times. Oh, that's nice, Tiffany responded with the kind of vague pleasantness people use when they want to acknowledge what you've said without actually engaging with it. She turned immediately to Marcus. Did you see that article about the new restaurant downtown? The one with the rooftop dining? And just like that, I became invisible. Not deliberately excluded, not actively dismissed, but simply overlooked as the conversation moved to topics more relevant to people who could walk upstairs without gasping, people who could enjoy outdoor dining without worrying about battery life on portable oxygen concentrators, people whose presence didn't require accommodation or consideration. Marcus participated enthusiastically in discussing restaurants and weekend plans, places they might visit, and activities they might enjoy, never once acknowledging that his mother sat 3 feet away, listening to them plan a life that had no space for someone like me. The oxygen concentrator hummed steadily beside my chair, marking each breath that kept me conscious enough to witness my own erasure from my son's future. After dinner, while I struggled to clear the table, a task that now required multiple rest breaks, I heard them laughing in the living room. Their conversation was animated, full of shared jokes and easy intimacy that reminded me painfully of conversations I'd once had, back when breathing was automatic and social interaction didn't require strategic energy conservation. She seems sweet, I heard Tiffany say, her voice carrying the particular tone people use when describing elderly relatives they feel obligated to tolerate. How long has she been sick? About 6 months with the oxygen thing, Marcus replied, and I could picture him shrugging dismissively. But she's been slowing down for a while. Age, you know. Some people handle it better than others. Age. Some people handle it better than others. As if my lung disease was a character failing rather than a consequence of decades spent in poorly ventilated hospitals, breathing industrial cleaning chemicals and secondhand stress while caring for his generation's parents and grandparents. That night, after Tiffany left with promises to call soon and plans to meet for dinner the following week, Marcus came into the kitchen where I was finishing the dishes. The task that used to take me 10 minutes now required 30, with frequent pauses to rest and recover my breath. "You don't have to do all that tonight, Mom," he said, but his tone suggested obligation rather than concern. "Tiffany and I are thinking about catching a late movie. You'll be okay here by yourself?" Of course I would be okay by myself. I'd been okay by myself for most of the past 25 years, raising him while working full-time, managing household finances and maintenance, navigating the complex challenges of single parenthood without family support or financial security. But his question wasn't really about my capability. It was about his guilt, his need for permission to abandon me for entertainment that didn't accommodate my limitations. "I'll be fine," I assured him, forcing a smile that I hoped looked more genuine than it felt. "Have fun at the movie." He kissed my forehead with the perfunctory affection of someone fulfilling a social obligation, grabbed his jacket, and left me alone with the sound of my own breathing and the steady hum of the machine that kept me alive. Through the window, I watched him drive away with the eager anticipation of someone escaping confinement, someone finally free to enjoy life without the burden of his mother's medical needs. That's when I began to understand that our relationship had fundamentally changed, shifted from mutual love and support to something much more one-sided and transactional. I was no longer his mother in any meaningful sense. I had become his responsibility, his obligation, his burden to bear until death provided the relief he was too polite to request directly. The realization should have been devastating, and in many ways it was. But it also carried an unexpected clarity, a painful but liberating understanding that allowed me to see our situation without the distorting filter of maternal love and desperate hope. My son didn't love me anymore. Maybe he never had, not in the way I'd loved him. Completely? unconditionally, with the fierce protectiveness that had defined my adult life. What I'd interpreted as love might have been dependency, convenience, the natural attachment of someone who benefits from another person's sacrifices without feeling compelled to reciprocate. And if that was true, if our relationship had always been this imbalanced, then perhaps it was time to stop pretending otherwise. Perhaps it was time to see Marcus as he really was, rather than as the person I desperately needed him to be. The thought terrified and liberated me in equal measure, because once you stop seeing someone through the lens of unconditional love, you start noticing things you'd previously overlooked. You start recognizing patterns of behavior that you'd excused as temporary stress or situational difficulty. You start seeing cruelty where you'd convinced yourself there was only thoughtlessness. And sometimes, that new clarity prepares you for revelations that would otherwise destroy you completely. The morning Marcus decided I was no longer welcome at my own dining table was the morning I realized how completely I had disappeared from my own life. It started with a simple request. Could I join him and his new girlfriend for breakfast? I had made pancakes, the recipe my mother taught me 50 years ago, the same breakfast I'd served him countless Saturday mornings throughout his childhood. Actually, Mom, he said, not looking up from his phone, Rachel and I were hoping to have some private time this morning. You understand, right? He gestured vaguely toward the living room, toward my usual chair next to the oxygen concentrator. Maybe you could eat in there today? Eat in there. In my own home, I was being asked to take my meals in isolation so my son and his girlfriend could enjoy breakfast at the table I had purchased. In the house I had worked 3 jobs to afford, eating food I had prepared with hands that shook from the effort of standing long enough to cook. Rachel smiled at me with the particular brand of false sweetness that young women reserve for older ones they consider irrelevant. I hope you don't mind, Mrs. Morrison. Marcus and I have so little time together with his work schedule. She reached across the table to touch his hand, a gesture of ownership that was clearly meant for my benefit. I minded. Of course I minded. But what could I say? That this was my house, my table, my life they were casually rearranging for their convenience? That I had earned the right to eat breakfast wherever I chose by virtue of 40 years of mortgage payments and the lung disease I'd developed while working to provide for the man who now found my presence inconvenient? Instead, I smiled and nodded, loading my plate with pancakes I no longer wanted, and retreating to the living room like a scolded child. Through the doorway, I could hear them laughing, their conversation animated and intimate in ways that emphasized my exclusion. They talked about weekend plans, about restaurants they wanted to try, about trips they might take, all activities that required mobility and energy I no longer possessed. Your mom seems lonely, I heard Rachel say, her voice carrying the kind of performative sympathy that allows people to acknowledge suffering without feeling obligated to address it. Maybe she should look into one of those senior communities. You know, somewhere with people her own age. I've thought about that, Marcus replied, and I could hear the relief in his voice at having someone else voice what he'd been thinking. She might be happier around other people dealing with similar health issues. This house is probably too much for her to manage anyway. Too much for me to manage. The house I had maintained for 15 years, where I still paid half the utilities and bought most of the groceries. The house where I'd raised him, where I'd nursed him through childhood illnesses and celebrated every achievement. Now it was too much for me to manage, because my son had decided my presence was incompatible with his romantic aspirations. That afternoon, while Marcus was at work, Rachel made herself at home in ways that felt like a hostile occupation. She rearranged furniture in the living room, moving my reading chair away from the window where natural light made it easier to see. When I asked if she could put it back, she smiled with exaggerated patience. Oh, Mrs. Morrison, this configuration creates so much better flow for the space. Don't you think it looks more modern? She gestured around the room with the authority of someone who'd watched too many home improvement shows. Marcus mentioned you might be thinking about downsizing anyway, so this could help you get used to smaller spaces. Marcus had mentioned no such thing to me, but apparently he'd been discussing my future living arrangements with a woman who'd been in our home for less than a month. I was being managed. My life reorganized by people who saw me as an obstacle to be maneuvered around rather than a person with opinions and preferences that mattered. The oxygen concentrator's cord no longer reached my repositioned chair comfortably, forcing me to sit closer to the machine, its mechanical hum now dominating whatever quiet activities I tried to pursue. Reading became difficult with the reduced lighting. The view from my new position faced the wall rather than the garden where I'd enjoyed watching birds and seasonal changes. But when I mentioned these issues, Rachel looked at me with the particular expression people reserve for elderly relatives who are being unreasonably demanding. "I'm sure you'll adjust," she said sweetly. "Sometimes change is good for us, even when it feels uncomfortable at first. Change is good for us." As if my comfort in my own home was less important than her aesthetic preferences. As if my needs were suggestions rather than requirements for basic quality of life. That evening, Marcus came home to find me struggling to read in the new seating arrangement, squinting in the reduced light, while the oxygen concentrator's noise made it difficult to concentrate. Instead of asking why his furniture had been rearranged, he complimented Rachel on the improvements she'd made. "Doesn't the room look so much better?" he asked, surveying her changes with obvious approval. "Rachel has such a good eye for design. Maybe she could help you organize your bedroom too, Mom. Make it more efficient for your needs." My needs. He spoke about my medical requirements like they were character flaws that could be corrected through better organization, rather than the daily reality of surviving with failing lungs in a world designed for healthy people. Over the following weeks, I watched Rachel systematically erase my presence from the common areas of my own home. Family photos that had stood on the mantel for decades were relocated to less prominent positions, replaced with decorative objects she'd brought from her apartment. The Afghan my mother had crocheted, the one I'd kept on the back of the couch for 15 years, disappeared entirely, presumably stored somewhere I was never consulted about. My collection of ceramic birds, accumulated over decades of gifts from patients' families and small purchases that had brought me joy during difficult periods, was deemed cluttered and packed away in boxes that Rachel labeled Mrs. Morrison's things, with the kind of organizational efficiency that turned a lifetime of small treasures into obstacles to be eliminated. "We're not throwing anything away," Marcus assured me when I asked about my belongings. "Everything is just being stored more efficiently. Rachel thinks the house shows better with less personal items around. Shows better. As if my home was a property being staged for sale. As if my personal belongings were impediments to some transaction I hadn't agreed to participate in. But the most devastating change was subtle, psychological, almost impossible to articulate in ways that would make my distress seem rational to outside observers. I was being systematically trained to ask permission for activities that had once been automatic rights. Could I watch television in the living room, or were Marcus and Rachel planning to use that space? Could I prepare meals at times that were convenient for me, or should I wait until they'd finished their own cooking? Every interaction became a negotiation in which my needs were consistently deemed less important than their preferences. I was a guest in my own home, tolerated rather than welcomed, accommodated rather than included. The oxygen concentrator, once simply a medical necessity I'd adapted to, became a symbol of everything that made me inconvenient to the people who now controlled my daily existence. Its tubing created trip hazards that Rachel complained about regularly. Its electrical requirements limited where furniture could be positioned. Its noise interfered with their television watching and romantic conversations. "Isn't there a quieter model available?" Rachel asked one evening, her question directed at Marcus rather than at me, as if I were a pet whose medical needs could be discussed in my presence without including me in the conversation. Some of the newer machines are supposed to be much less intrusive. Intrusive. My breathing apparatus was intrusive to people who had intruded into my life, my home, my space. The machine that kept me alive was less important than their comfort, their convenience, their preferences. Marcus promised to research quieter alternatives, to speak with my doctor about options that might be less disruptive to household harmony. As if my medical needs were the disruption rather than his decision to move a girlfriend into our home without consulting me, to rearrange my living space without consideration for my physical limitations, to treat me like an inconvenient roommate rather than the mother who had sacrificed everything for his well-being. That night, lying in bed with the oxygen cannula positioned carefully in my nostrils and the concentrator humming beside me, I tried to understand how I had become so invisible in my own life. When had my opinions stopped mattering? When had my comfort become negotiable? When had I transformed from the most important person in Marcus's world to someone whose continued existence required justification? The answers were painful, but increasingly clear. I had never been as important to him as he had been to me. My love, my sacrifice, my devotion, these had been convenient rather than reciprocal. I had built my entire adult identity around being his mother, but he had apparently built his identity around escaping the limitations that my love had imposed. Now that my body was failing, now that I required assistance rather than providing it, now that caring for me would demand sacrifice from him rather than the reverse, I had become expendable. Not dramatically, not through any single act of cruelty, but through the slow erosion of respect that happens when someone realizes they hold all the power in a relationship. I was disappearing from my own story, becoming a minor character in the narrative of my son's romantic happiness. My health, my comfort, my preferences, all of these were background details to be managed efficiently so the main characters could pursue their desires without impediment. But lying there in the darkness, listening to the machine that kept me alive, and watching the digital display that monitored my oxygen saturation, I began to wonder if complete invisibility might actually offer certain advantages. When people stop seeing you as a threat, they stop hiding their true intentions. When they assume you're powerless, they become careless about concealing their cruelty. Maybe being invisible would allow me to see things I'd been missing, to understand dynamics I'd been too hopeful to recognize. Maybe disappearing from their story would help me reclaim my own. The thought both terrified and intrigued me. Because once you accept that you've become invisible to the people who should love you most, you start realizing that invisibility might be the beginning of a different kind of power altogether. The day I found my wedding ring in the trash was the day I realized that hope could die while your heart still beat. It wasn't even hidden, just sitting on top of coffee grounds and yesterday's newspaper, the simple gold band that had symbolized 28 years of marriage to Marcus's father. The ring I'd never removed even after David died, even through the loneliest nights of single parenthood. Rachel had been organizing my bedroom while I napped, supposedly helping me declutter for better mobility around my oxygen equipment. When I asked about the ring, she shrugged with the casual indifference of someone discarding outdated magazines. "Oh, that old thing? Marcus said it was just taking up space in your jewelry box. You don't wear it anymore anyway, right?" She smiled with the practiced sweetness that had become her signature expression when delivering small cruelties disguised as helpfulness. "He thought it might be healthier for you to let go of the past. Healthier for me to let go of the past. My marriage, my husband's memory, the symbol of the only true love I'd ever known, all reduced to clutter that needed elimination for my own good." But when I looked at Marcus for confirmation, for some indication that this had been a misunderstanding, he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Mom, you haven't worn it in months," he said, his voice carrying the patient tone people use with elderly relatives who are being unreasonable about sentimental objects. "Rachel thought it might be upsetting for you to keep looking at reminders of Dad's death. Reminders of Dad's death. Not reminders of Dad's life, of our love, of the 28 years we'd built together before cancer took him from us. No, according to my son, the ring was a source of unhealthy dwelling on loss rather than a treasured connection to the man who had loved me unconditionally, who had seen me as precious rather than burdensome." I retrieved the ring from the trash with trembling fingers, washing it carefully in the kitchen sink while they continued their conversation about my psychological well-being. The gold was still warm from the garbage, still solid despite their attempts to declare it worthless. I slipped it back onto my finger where it belonged, where it had lived for 37 years, where it would remain until someone pried it from my cold, dead hand. But the message had been delivered with crystal clarity. Nothing I valued was sacred to them. My past, my memories, my connections to people who had actually loved me, all of this was expendable in service of their vision for a more efficient, less emotionally complicated household. Over the following weeks, other treasured items began disappearing. The photo of David and me on our honeymoon, young and radiant with the kind of happiness that survives in pictures long after it's been buried with the people who felt it. The ceramic mug he'd given me for Mother's Day the year before he died, with Marcus's handprints pressed into the clay when he was 7 years old. the Afghan my mother had crocheted during her final years, each stitch a meditation on love that transcended her arthritis pain. "We're just making space," Marcus would explain when I asked about missing belongings. "The house feels so much lighter without all that old stuff weighing everything down." Old stuff. My life reduced to weight that was dragging down people who had never experienced genuine loss, who confused sentiment with weakness because they'd never needed the comfort that memories could provide during the long nights when breathing became a conscious effort rather than an automatic function. Rachel began leaving real estate brochures around the house. Not apartment listings, but information about assisted living facilities and senior communities, with names like Sunset Manor and Golden Years Village. She'd highlight features that supposedly addressed my medical needs: 24-hour nursing care, meals prepared by professional kitchens, recreational activities designed for people with limited mobility. "Just look at this one," she'd say, spreading glossy pamphlets across the kitchen table while I ate my increasingly solitary meals. "They have oxygen supplies available in every room. You wouldn't have to worry about moving your equipment around. And there's medical staff right on site in case of emergencies." In case of emergencies. The phrase carried ominous undertones that made my chest tighten in ways that had nothing to do with lung capacity. What kind of emergencies was she anticipating? What scenarios had she and Marcus discussed that made professional medical supervision seem urgently necessary? But the most devastating change was the gradual elimination of my role in household decisions that had once been mine by right. The grocery shopping, which I'd handled for 15 years despite my limited mobility, was reassigned to Rachel for efficiency. The meal planning, which had allowed me to accommodate my dietary restrictions while managing our modest budget, became her responsibility to reduce stress on your system. Even my own medical appointments were being scheduled around their convenience rather than my needs or preferences. "Tuesday afternoon won't work," Marcus would tell my doctor's office while I sat beside him in the waiting room, my presence apparently irrelevant to discussions about my own health care. "Rachel has a work commitment that day, and Mom shouldn't be alone after medical procedures." Shouldn't be alone after medical procedures. As if I were a child who couldn't be trusted to manage my own recovery, rather than a woman who had spent decades caring for post-surgical patients, who understood medical protocols better than both of them combined. The infantilization was systematic and deliberate, designed to establish their authority over decisions that had once been exclusively mine. My doctor, Dr. Patterson, began addressing his questions to Marcus rather than to me, asking about my medication compliance and symptom progression as if I weren't sitting 3 feet away with the cognitive capacity to discuss my own condition. "Has she been experiencing increased shortness of breath during normal activities?" Dr. Patterson asked, consulting his chart while Marcus nodded with the gravity of someone reporting on a patient rather than his mother. "She seems to get winded just walking from room to room," Marcus replied, his tone carrying the particular concern that people reserve for describing beloved pets with declining health. "And she's been napping a lot during the day. Rachel thinks she might be depressed." Rachel thinks. Rachel, who had known me for 6 weeks, was now providing professional psychological assessments to my physician, while I sat invisible in their conversation about my mental state. My actual feelings, my actual experiences, my actual capacity for self-reporting, none of this mattered when younger, healthier people were available to speak on my behalf. That evening, I overheard them discussing my declining cognitive function, in voices they thought were too quiet for me to hear. They were concerned, they said, about my ability to make rational decisions about my living situation. They'd noticed increased confusion, difficulty following conversations, possible signs of early dementia that might explain my unreasonable attachment to staying in my own home. Unreasonable attachment. My desire to remain in the house I'd purchased, in the space where I'd raised my son and grieved my husband, where I'd built the only stable life I'd ever known. This was evidence of cognitive decline rather than the natural human preference for familiar surroundings during illness. But I wasn't confused. My mind remained sharp, painfully clear in its ability to recognize the systematic campaign being waged against my independence. I understood exactly what was happening. They were constructing a narrative of incompetence that would justify whatever decisions they'd already made about my future. The loneliness during this period was unlike anything I'd experienced. Even during the darkest days after David's death, grief at least had been honest. A clean wound that hurt terribly, but acknowledged the reality of what had been lost. This was different. The slow strangulation of hope by people who smiled while they tightened the noose. I began spending more time in my bedroom, not because I was depressed, but because it was the only space they hadn't completely colonized with their vision of how my life should be organized. Here, with my oxygen concentrator humming steadily, and my few remaining personal belongings arranged on surfaces they hadn't yet deemed cluttered, I could remember who I had been before illness transformed me into a management problem. Late at night, when the house finally quieted and their voices no longer carried through the walls with plans for my future, I would lie in bed and try to recall the sound of unconditional love, David's voice saying my name like a prayer. Marcus's childhood laughter when I'd chase him through these same rooms, both of us breathless with joy rather than medical necessity. Those memories felt increasingly distant, like photographs that had been left in sunlight too long until the colors faded and the faces became unrecognizable. I was losing not just my present but my past, watching decades of love and sacrifice being rewritten as burden and obligation by people who needed me to be less than I was, so they could feel justified in treating me as less than I deserved. But lying there in the darkness, with the pulse oximeter's red light blinking steadily against my fingertip and the cannula delivering the 2 liters per minute that kept me conscious, I began to understand something that surprised me. I still had something left. Something they hadn't managed to take yet. I had my clarity, my ability to see them exactly as they were, stripped of the illusions that maternal love had painted over their selfishness for so many years. And maybe, just maybe, that clarity would prove more valuable than all the hope they'd managed to strangle. Because people who underestimate invisible women sometimes discover too late that invisibility can be its own form of power. The night everything changed started like any other. I was lying in bed, listening to Marcus and Rachel argue about money in the kitchen, their voices carrying through walls that had grown thin with age and neglect. But this time, instead of trying to block out their conversation, I found myself listening with the focused attention of someone gathering intelligence. "The property taxes are due next month," Marcus was saying, his tone carrying the familiar frustration he reserved for discussing anything related to maintaining the house. "And the insurance premium just went up again because of her medical equipment. This place is bleeding money. How much equity is in the house?" Rachel asked, and something in her voice made me sit up straighter, my pulse quickening in ways that triggered the oximeter's gentle beep. "About 200,000, maybe more with the market the way it is now," Marcus replied. "But it's not like I can access any of that while she's living here. She's on the deed as joint owner, and you know how stubborn she can be about moving." Joint owner. The phrase hit me like a revelation. After all these months of being treated like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, I had somehow forgotten the most basic fact about my situation. I owned half of this house. My name was on the deed. My money had helped purchase it. Legally, morally, practically, this was as much my home as it was his. What if something happened to her? Rachel's question was asked with the casual tone someone might use when discussing weather patterns, but the implications made my blood run cold. "I mean, she's already so sick, and she's not getting any younger." "Don't talk like that," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She's not dying tomorrow. Though honestly, sometimes I wonder if she'd be happier in a place with more support. This house is too much responsibility for someone in her condition. Too much responsibility." The house I had maintained for 15 years, where I still managed to keep my bedroom and bathroom clean, where I prepared my own meals and managed my own medication schedule. Apparently, living independently while requiring oxygen therapy was evidence of incompetence rather than remarkable resilience. But something in their conversation had awakened something in me that had been dormant for months. Not anger, which was too hot and consuming for someone with limited energy reserves, but something cooler and more sustainable. Determination. The quiet resolve that had carried me through night shifts as a single mother, through David's cancer treatments, through decades of challenges that would have broken weaker people. I was not as powerless as they believed. More importantly, I was not as helpless as I had allowed myself to become. The next morning, While they slept late after another evening of planning my future without consulting me, I made a phone call that felt like the first proactive decision I'd made in months. Margaret Chen, my former supervisor at the hospital, had given me her personal number years ago with instructions to call if I ever needed anything. At the time, I'd assumed she was just being polite, but now I wondered if her offer had been genuine. Irene. Margaret's voice carried surprise and warmth when she answered. How are you doing? I heard about your diagnosis from some of the other nurses. I've been wondering how you were managing, how I was managing. The question seemed to open floodgates I hadn't realized existed, and suddenly I was telling her everything. Not the sanitized version I'd been presenting to acquaintances who asked casually about my health, but the raw truth about what my life had become since Marcus moved back home. Margaret listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of sympathy that told me she understood not just the medical challenges, but the family dynamics that often accompanied serious illness. When I finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. Irene, honey, what you're describing isn't normal family caregiving, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen every variation of how families responded to medical crises. This sounds like financial abuse disguised as concern. Have you spoken to anyone about your legal rights? Legal rights. The phrase felt foreign, like a concept that applied to other people's situations rather than mine. I was a mother dealing with an ungrateful son, not a victim of abuse requiring legal intervention. But as Margaret continued talking, explaining patterns she'd witnessed during her decades in healthcare, I began to recognize elements of my own experience in her descriptions. The isolation, the infantilization, the systematic removal of decision-making authority. These are classic signs of elder abuse, Margaret continued. And if your son is already discussing your house as an asset he can't access, you need to protect yourself immediately. Elder abuse. The term felt like a diagnosis I didn't want to accept, like acknowledging that my situation had crossed the line from family dysfunction into something that required outside intervention. But denial wasn't going to protect me if Marcus and Rachel had already begun planning my removal from my own home. What should I do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as I realized how completely I had surrendered control over my own life. First, you document everything, Margaret said with the practical efficiency that had made her an excellent supervisor. Start keeping a record of conversations, decisions made without your input, belongings that disappear. And I want you to call my friend Janet Rodriguez. She's a social worker who specializes in elder advocacy. Don't wait, Irene. Call her today. After I hung up, I sat in my bedroom for a long time, staring at the oxygen concentrator that had become the symbol of everything that made me burdensome to my son. But instead of seeing it as evidence of weakness, I began to view it differently, as proof that I was still fighting, still surviving, still present despite their efforts to erase me. That afternoon, I called Janet Rodriguez and scheduled a meeting for the following week. Then I began doing something I hadn't done in months. I started paying attention to my own life with the systematic care I'd once brought to patient advocacy. I retrieved a notebook from the kitchen drawer, one of several that Rachel had deemed unnecessary clutter, and began documenting incidents I'd previously dismissed as minor conflicts or misunderstandings. The pattern that emerged was both clearer and more disturbing than I'd realized. February 15th. Marcus scheduled my cardiology appointment without consulting me, choosing a time that conflicted with Rachel's work schedule, then told the doctor I was becoming forgetful about medical appointments. February 22nd. Rachel threw away my collection of thank you cards from former patients, claiming they were just taking up space and probably making me sad. March 3rd. Marcus changed the passwords on my online banking accounts for security reasons, then began monitoring all my financial transactions without my permission. March 10th. Rachel convinced Marcus to donate my nursing textbooks to charity, saying I was dwelling too much on my former career instead of accepting my current limitations. Each entry revealed another thread in what was clearly a systematic campaign to establish their control while undermining my capacity for independence. They weren't just making decisions for me, they were creating conditions that would justify making those decisions, manufacturing evidence of my incompetence while eliminating my resources for resistance. But as I wrote, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling more victimized by cataloging their behavior, I felt increasingly empowered by my ability to see it clearly. Knowledge, as I'd learned during my nursing career, was the foundation of effective intervention. You couldn't treat symptoms you hadn't properly diagnosed. And now, I was finally diagnosing my situation with the clarity that had once made me an excellent nurse. Marcus and Rachel weren't family members struggling to provide appropriate care. They were opportunists who had identified a vulnerable person and were systematically exploiting that vulnerability for their own benefit. The realization should have been devastating, but instead it felt liberating, because once you understand exactly what you're fighting against, you can begin developing strategies for fighting back. That evening, I listened to their dinner conversation with new ears, cataloging casual references to "when Mom moves to assisted living" and "after we renovate her bedroom for guests." They spoke about my future with the confidence of people who believed their planning was already complete, their success inevitable. They had no idea that the invisible woman they'd been so efficiently erasing had begun to see everything with perfect clarity. They'd underestimated the intelligence that decades of patient advocacy had developed, the resilience that single motherhood had forged, the determination that surviving David's death had revealed. But I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was too expensive for someone operating on limited energy reserves. Instead, I felt something more sustainable and ultimately more dangerous to people who had built their plans on the assumption of my powerlessness. I felt determined, and tomorrow, I would begin to act on that determination in ways they never saw coming. Janet Rodriguez arrived at my door exactly on time, carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years helping vulnerable people reclaim their power. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with kind eyes that missed nothing, and a way of speaking that made complex legal concepts feel accessible rather than intimidating. "Before we talk about anything else," she said, settling into the chair across from me while Marcus was at work and Rachel was at her yoga class, "I want you to know that you have rights. Regardless of your health condition, regardless of who lives in this house, regardless of what anyone has told you, you have rights that cannot be taken away without your explicit consent. Rights." The word felt foreign after months of being told what was best for me and necessary for my safety by people who had never consulted me about my own preferences. Janet's calm certainty that I still possessed agency was like oxygen to someone who had been suffocating without realizing it. She reviewed my documentation with the methodical attention of someone who understood that patterns of abuse were often revealed in small details rather than dramatic incidents. When she finished reading, she looked at me with something between sadness and admiration. "Irene, what you've documented here is a textbook case of financial and emotional elder abuse," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "The systematic isolation, the removal of decision-making authority, the disposal of your personal property without consent. All of this constitutes abuse under state law." "But he's my son," I said, the words feeling automatic, programmed by decades of unconditional maternal love. "Surely he wouldn't deliberately—" "Abuse doesn't require malicious intent," Janet interrupted quietly. "Sometimes it happens when family members convince themselves that controlling someone else's life is an act of love, but regardless of their motivations, the impact on you is what matters legally." She explained my options with the patience of someone who understood that elderly people are often reluctant to take legal action against their own children. I could file for a restraining order. I could report the financial abuse to Adult Protective Services. I could change the locks and legally evict Marcus from my home. All of these felt too dramatic, too final for a mother who still remembered teaching her son to tie his shoes and nursing him through childhood fevers. But Janet had one more suggestion. Something that felt more manageable, yet potentially more effective. "What if we arranged a family meeting?" she asked. "Sometimes when people realize their behavior has legal consequences, they become more willing to negotiate respectfully. I could attend as your advocate, help ensure your voice is heard clearly." A family meeting. The phrase sounded almost quaint, like something from a television show about functional families who resolved conflicts through honest communication. But there was something appealing about the idea of confronting this situation directly, rather than continuing to suffer in invisible silence. "I'd like that," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "When?" Janet suggested we schedule it for the following Sunday, giving everyone time to prepare and ensuring Marcus couldn't claim he'd been ambushed or hadn't had adequate notice. She would help me outline my concerns beforehand and coach me on how to communicate my boundaries clearly. "Remember," she said as she prepared to leave, "you're not asking for permission to live in your own home. You're informing them of what you will and will not accept going forward. There's a difference, and that difference is everything." That evening, I told Marcus and Rachel that I'd like to have a family discussion about our living situation. I kept my tone neutral, unthreatening, the same voice I'd used for years when trying to address household issues without creating conflict. "A family meeting?" Rachel's eyebrows rose with the particular skepticism she reserved for what she considered my more unreasonable requests. "What's there to discuss? Everything seems fine the way it is." Everything seems fine. For her, perhaps. She'd successfully colonized my home, reorganized my belongings, and established herself as the decision-maker for major household choices. From her perspective, our current arrangement was probably ideal. "I just think it would be good for all of us to be clear about expectations," I said carefully. "And I've invited someone to join us. A friend who has experience with family dynamics." Marcus looked up from his phone for the first time since I'd started speaking. "What kind of friend?" "You don't really have friends anymore, Mom. Most of your old colleagues have their own problems to deal with." The casual cruelty of the observation, accurate though it was, still had the power to sting. But instead of defending myself or trying to explain, I simply smiled and said we'd discuss everything on Sunday. Over the next few days, I noticed them whispering more frequently, their conversations stopping abruptly when I entered rooms. They were clearly planning something, coordinating their approach to whatever confrontation they anticipated. But their planning was based on the assumption that I remained the same confused, overwhelmed woman they'd been managing for months. They had no idea that I'd been keeping detailed records of our interactions, or that I'd consulted with professionals who understood elder abuse patterns, or that I now saw their behavior through the lens of legal rather than familial frameworks. They were preparing to handle the mother they thought they knew, not the advocate I was becoming. Janet returned on Saturday afternoon to help me prepare. We rehearsed responses to likely objections, practiced staying calm when they attempted to redirect conversations toward my health rather than their behavior, developed strategies for maintaining focus when they tried to make me feel guilty for causing family drama. "Remember," Janet coached, "they're going to try to make this about your medical needs and your supposed inability to make rational decisions. Every time they do that, bring the conversation back to specific behaviors and concrete boundaries." She helped me organize my documentation into clear categories: financial decisions made without my consent, personal property disposed of without permission, medical appointments scheduled without consultation, household changes implemented despite my objections. The pattern was overwhelming when presented systematically, rather than experienced as isolated incidents. "One more thing," Janet said as we finished our preparation. "They're going to be shocked that you've taken this step. People who are used to controlling someone else's narrative don't expect that person to suddenly start telling their own story. Use their surprise to your advantage." That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months. Not because the situation had improved, but because I finally felt like an active participant in my own life, rather than a passive recipient of other people's decisions. Tomorrow, I would speak for myself with the support of someone who understood my rights and the documentation to prove my case. Marcus and Rachel spent Saturday evening in intense conversation, their voices too low for me to hear specific words, but their body language suggesting they were developing strategy for Sunday's meeting. Rachel made several phone calls, probably to friends or family members who would validate their perspective on my unreasonable behavior. But as I lay in bed listening to their muffled planning, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anticipation rather than dread. For so long, I'd been reacting to their initiatives, responding to their changes, accommodating their demands. Tomorrow, for the first time since this ordeal began, I would be the one setting the agenda. The oxygen concentrator hummed beside my bed, its steady rhythm no longer a reminder of weakness, but a soundtrack to resilience. I was still breathing. I was still thinking clearly. I was still capable of fighting for myself when fighting became necessary. And tomorrow, Marcus and Rachel were going to discover that the invisible woman they'd been so casually dismissing had been watching, listening, learning, and planning. They'd mistaken silence for submission, assumed that physical vulnerability meant complete powerlessness. They were about to learn how wrong they'd been, but even as I felt this new strength building inside me, I had no idea that their response would be more desperate and dangerous than anything I'd prepared for. Because people who are used to controlling others don't give up that control easily, and when they realize their power is being challenged, they sometimes reveal depths of cruelty that even the most prepared advocate couldn't anticipate. Sunday came with the deceptive calm of a day that would change everything. I woke early, dressed carefully in clothes that made me feel dignified rather than diminished, and positioned myself in the living room where the family meeting would take place. The oxygen concentrator sat beside my chair like a faithful companion, its gentle hum a reminder that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of fighting for myself. Marcus and Rachel appeared at exactly 2 p.m., their faces wearing expressions of forced patience that barely concealed their irritation at being summoned to discuss what they clearly considered my unreasonable demands. They'd dressed as if attending a business meeting, Marcus in a button-down shirt and khakis, Rachel in a blazer that suggested she was taking this more seriously than her casual dismissal the previous evening had indicated. Janet arrived precisely on time, carrying a professional demeanor and a briefcase that immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room. This wasn't going to be a casual family chat. This was an official intervention with legal implications. "Hello, Marcus." "Hello, Rachel," Janet said, extending her hand with the calm authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult family dynamics. "I'm Janet Rodriguez, and I'm here as Irene's advocate to help facilitate this conversation." The word advocate hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus's face went through several expressions: surprise, confusion, then a carefully controlled anger that told me he understood this meeting wasn't going to proceed according to his expectations. "I'm sorry," Rachel said, her voice carrying the particular tone people use when they're not sorry at all. "But I don't understand why we need an outsider involved in private family matters." "Because private family matters have become a pattern of behavior that violates Irene's basic rights," Janet replied smoothly. "And sometimes outside perspective helps everyone understand when boundaries have been crossed." I watched Marcus process this information, saw him realize that his months of systematic control were about to be examined by someone who couldn't be managed or manipulated the way he'd learned to handle me. His jaw tightened with the barely contained fury of someone discovering that their victim had found allies. Janet opened her briefcase and withdrew my documentation, months of careful records that revealed patterns I'd been too close to see clearly. "Irene has asked me to review some concerns she has about the current living arrangement. These aren't complaints or accusations. They're simply facts that we need to address together." She began reading from my notes with clinical precision. The disposal of my personal belongings without consent, medical appointments scheduled without consultation, financial decisions made without my input or approval, the systematic removal of my decision-making authority in my own home. With each item, Marcus's face grew darker, his hands clenching into fists that he kept carefully in his lap. Rachel maintained her expression of innocent confusion, as if hearing about behaviors she couldn't possibly have participated in. "Mom," Marcus said when Janet finished, his voice carrying the patient tone he'd perfected for managing what he considered my unreasonable demands. "You're making this sound much more dramatic than it actually is. We've been trying to help you, trying to make your life easier. Everything we've done has been for your own good. For your own good." The phrase that had justified every violation of my autonomy, every dismissal of my preferences, every decision made without consulting the person most affected by its consequences. "I understand that you believe your intentions were good," Janet said before I could respond. "But impact matters more than intention. And the impact of these behaviors has been to systematically remove Irene's control over her own life. She has a serious medical condition," Rachel interjected, her voice rising with the particular indignation of someone who's been caught but refuses to admit wrongdoing. "She needs help managing basic daily activities. We're providing that help." "Irene manages her medication schedule independently," Janet replied, consulting her notes. "She prepares her own meals, maintains her personal hygiene, handles her own medical equipment. What specific daily activities require your management? The question hung in the air, exposing the foundation of lies they'd built their control upon. I wasn't incapacitated. I was inconvenient. My oxygen dependency made me slower, less mobile, but it hadn't affected my cognitive abilities or my legal rights. That's when Marcus's facade finally cracked completely. "You want to know what activities she can't handle?" he said, his voice dropping to a tone I'd never heard before. Something cold and cruel that made my chest tighten with fear rather than medical distress. "She can't handle the fact that she's dying. She can't handle that she's become a burden to everyone around her. She can't handle that she's using up resources that could be better spent on people who actually have futures." The words hit me like physical blows, each one finding wounds I hadn't realized existed. Using up resources. People who actually have futures. This was my son. The child I'd carried for 9 months. The boy I'd raised with unconditional love. The man I'd supported through every crisis and celebrated through every achievement. "Marcus," Janet's voice carried warning, the tone of someone who'd heard family dynamics turn ugly before. "I think you need to—" "No," he interrupted, standing up with sudden violence that made both Rachel and me flinch. "I'm tired of pretending this is some kind of reasonable discussion. She's dying, okay? Her lungs are failing. She's going to get worse. And she's going to drag all of us down with her unless we do something about it. Do something about it." The phrase carried implications that made my blood run cold, suggestions of solutions that hadn't been openly discussed, but had clearly been privately considered. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Janet asked, her professional composure intact, but her voice carrying an edge that suggested she was beginning to understand the true nature of what we were dealing with. Marcus looked at me directly for the first time since the meeting began, his eyes holding an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not frustration, but something that looked almost like hatred. "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time for Mom to accept reality," he said, his voice deadly calm. "She's not going to get better. She's only going to get worse. And some of us have lives we'd like to live without being held hostage by someone who should have the decency to just let go. Let go." The euphemism hung in the air like poison, its meaning clear to everyone present. My son wasn't just asking me to move to assisted living. He was suggesting that my continued existence was an imposition that I should resolve through the ultimate surrender. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Rachel looked shocked by the mask that had finally slipped, revealing the depth of resentment that had been building beneath months of false concern and manufactured care. But instead of feeling crushed by his cruelty, I felt something unexpected. Clarity. Perfect, diamond-hard clarity about exactly who my son was and what he was capable of. Janet had been right. Sometimes people revealed their true nature when they realized their control was being challenged. "I think this meeting is over," Janet said quietly, closing her briefcase with movements that suggested she was already planning next steps. "Irene, would you like me to stay while Marcus and Rachel gather their belongings?" The implication was clear. They would be leaving, not me. This was my house, my home, my life, and I had every legal right to evict people who had revealed themselves to be actively hostile to my continued existence. But as Marcus absorbed what Janet had said, his expression shifted into something that made every instinct I'd developed over 55 years of life scream warnings about imminent danger. "No," he said, his voice carrying a finality that chilled me to the bone. "No, I don't think so." And that's when I realized that Sunday afternoon was about to become something much more dangerous than a family meeting gone wrong. Because when people who've built their plans around your powerlessness discover you're not as powerless as they believed, they sometimes become desperate enough to ensure that powerlessness permanently. What happened next would teach me that even mothers who think they know their children completely can be shocked by the depths of cruelty human beings are capable of when they feel cornered. What happened next unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. Marcus stepped toward my chair, his face twisted with rage I'd never seen before, and reached for the power cord of my oxygen concentrator. The machine that had kept me alive for 8 months, that hummed faithfully beside me through every difficult day and sleepless night. "You want to make decisions about your own life?" he said, his voice carrying a coldness that froze my blood. "Let's see how many decisions you can make without this." He yanked the plug from the wall outlet, The concentrator's gentle hum died instantly, replaced by a silence that felt like death approaching. The red alarm light began blinking as the machine's backup power kicked in, maybe 20 minutes of battery life before the oxygen flow would stop completely. "Try breathing now," Marcus said with a smile that would haunt my dreams forever, if I lived long enough to have dreams again. Janet lunged toward him, but Rachel grabbed her arm, restraining her with surprising strength while Marcus stood over me, blocking access to the power outlet. They had planned this, I realized with horrifying clarity. They had discussed what to do if I fought back, developed a strategy for ensuring I couldn't resist their control. The battery indicator on my concentrator showed 18 minutes remaining. 18 minutes to live unless I could somehow reach the plug or convince my son to reconnect the machine that kept his mother breathing. "Marcus, please," I gasped, already feeling the familiar tightness in my chest that preceded oxygen deprivation. "Please don't do this." "I'm not doing anything, Mom," he replied with calm satisfaction. "You're the one who wanted to make your own decisions. So decide. Are you going to keep fighting us? Or are you going to accept that some problems solve themselves naturally? Naturally? As if my death would be a natural consequence rather than murder by deliberate medical neglect. As if disconnecting life support equipment was somehow different from pointing a gun or administering poison." Janet was struggling against Rachel's grip, demanding they release her, threatening legal consequences that seemed laughably inadequate given the immediate reality of my approaching suffocation. 15 minutes of battery power remaining, and already my vision was beginning to blur around the edges. But then something extraordinary happened. Something Marcus couldn't have planned for, couldn't have anticipated, couldn't have prevented no matter how carefully he'd orchestrated this moment. My phone rang. Not my cell phone, which Rachel had moved to the kitchen counter so I wouldn't be disturbed during our meeting, but the landline I'd kept in my bedroom for emergencies. The phone I'd programmed with automatic redial for my doctor's office, for emergency services, for Margaret Chen. The phone I'd secretly activated that morning with a feature I'd discovered during my years of patient advocacy, an open line that would automatically dial emergency services if I pressed a specific button combination, creating a recorded connection that would capture everything happening in my house. The ringing stopped, followed by the subtle click of an active connection, and suddenly, Marcus's confession, his deliberate disconnection of my life support, his calm explanation of how my death would solve his problems, all of it was being recorded by emergency dispatch, creating evidence that would survive even if I didn't. "What was that?" Rachel asked, her grip on Janet loosening as she tried to identify the source of the sound. But I knew exactly what it was, and for the first time in months, I smiled with genuine satisfaction rather than forced pleasantries. "That," I said, my voice growing weaker, but my words carrying perfect clarity, "was my insurance policy." Marcus's confidence began to crack as he realized something had changed. Some element he hadn't accounted for was shifting the balance of power. The battery indicator showed 12 minutes remaining, but I was no longer afraid. Whatever happened to me, the truth was now being preserved by people whose job was to respond to exactly this kind of emergency. "You see," I continued, speaking directly to the open phone line that was capturing every word, "I learned something during my nursing career. When you're dealing with people who might hurt you, you always have backup systems, emergency protocols, ways to call for help even when you can't reach a phone. 10 minutes of battery power remaining, but I could already hear sirens in the distance. Emergency services had traced the call, identified the address, dispatched units to investigate a potential medical emergency that had revealed itself to be attempted murder. Marcus finally understood what was happening, but it was too late for him to change anything. He lunged toward the bedroom where the landline was recording everything, but Janet had broken free from Rachel's distracted grip and tackled him before he could reach the phone. 8 minutes of battery power, but the sirens were getting closer. Paramedics who would restore my oxygen, police officers who would arrest my son for attempted murder, social workers who would ensure this could never happen again. The front door burst open without ceremony. Emergency responders who'd heard enough through the open line to know they were dealing with a life-threatening situation. Two paramedics rushed toward me while police officers secured Marcus and Rachel, reading them rights that seemed almost anticlimactic after what I'd just survived. "Ma'am, we're going to reconnect your oxygen immediately," one paramedic said, plugging my concentrator back into the wall outlet while his partner checked my vital signs. The familiar hum resumed, delivering life-sustaining oxygen to lungs that had been starved for critical minutes. 5 minutes of battery power had remained. 5 minutes between me and suffocation, between survival and becoming another elderly victim of family members who found caregiving inconvenient. Marcus was handcuffed and loaded into a police car, his face no longer carrying the confident cruelty of someone certain he could eliminate problems without consequences. Rachel followed in a separate vehicle, her protests about misunderstandings and family disputes falling on ears that had heard the recorded evidence of premeditated attempted murder. But the most satisfying moment came 3 days later, when I sat in a courtroom wearing clean clothes and breathing oxygen delivered through a portable concentrator that I controlled completely. Marcus, dressed in an orange jumpsuit that symbolized how completely his circumstances had changed, looked smaller somehow, diminished by the reality of facing consequences for actions he'd assumed would remain secret. The recording played for the judge, the jury, the packed courtroom that included Margaret Chen, Janet Rodriguez, and several former colleagues who'd driven hours to show support for someone they'd never forgotten. Marcus's voice filled the room, cold and calculating as he explained why his mother should just let go, why her continued existence was inconvenient to his plans. "Try breathing now," echoed through the courtroom, followed by his satisfied explanation of how my death would solve his problems naturally. 23 people heard my son calmly describe murdering his mother as if it were a reasonable solution to financial inconvenience. The judge's sentence was 15 to 25 years for attempted murder with special circumstances, deliberate disconnection of life support equipment with intent to cause death. Rachel received 5 to 10 years as an accessory, her restraint of Janet during my attack making her complicit in attempted murder. But justice, real justice, came in the form of what happened next. The house they'd tried to steal became mine completely, sold to fund the kind of care I actually needed rather than the institutional warehousing they'd planned. The money Marcus thought he'd inherit funded my comfortable apartment in a community where I chose my own meals, made my own decisions, and lived independently with appropriate medical support. I started volunteering with elder advocacy groups, sharing my story with other families where financial abuse was disguised as caregiving. My experience became a case study used to train social workers, nurses, and police officers about recognizing when family dynamics cross into criminal behavior. Most importantly, I learned something that surprised everyone, including myself. I was stronger than anyone had realized. The woman who'd been systematically erased from her own life had resurged with capabilities that adversity had revealed rather than destroyed. 6 months after that terrible Sunday, I stood in my new apartment, breathing oxygen that belonged to me, surrounded by belongings I'd chosen to keep, planning activities I wanted to pursue. The ceramic birds Rachel had hidden were displayed prominently on shelves I'd arranged myself. My wedding ring caught morning light as I watered plants that grew because I'd decided they deserved life and care. The phone rang, not with threats or manipulation, but with calls from friends who valued my company, advocacy organizations seeking my expertise, family members who'd learned about my situation and wanted to reconnect with the relative they'd almost lost. I answered every call myself, breathing freely, speaking clearly, making my own decisions about who deserved my time and attention. My son had tried to silence me permanently, but instead had given me a voice that would be heard in courtrooms, classrooms, and communities for years to come. Sometimes the best revenge against people who try to erase you is simply refusing to disappear. Sometimes justice means outliving those who tried to kill you, thriving beyond their worst expectations, becoming more visible than they ever wanted you to be. I breathe freely now. And that breath carries the power to tell stories that might save other invisible women from sons who forget that mothers are human beings, rather than problems to be solved. The oxygen flows at 2 liters per minute, marking time I reclaimed, moments I survived, breaths that became testimony to the resilience of people others underestimate. and every breath reminds me that I am still here, still fighting, still refusing to let go.